What crazy ass story do you need to tell?
3 to 4 years ago, I was living in this bigger European city approximately to mill people for some years now. I went with a girl to a pub, and since all tables were full, we sat at the bar. There was an older guy sitting next to me, 50-ish, white hair, smoking a cigar who kind distracted me because he reminded me of my uncle. Now mind, my uncle was living in the US for around 25 years already. He didn't look like that dude. Nor did he act similar. That bar guy just had some gestures that reminded me of him, mixed with the look of another distant relative, Sue. The girl I was with goes to the toilet, so I can't hold back anymore and look this dude in the eyes and tell him he reminds me of my uncle. He jokingly asks, "What's his name?" I tell him, and also tell him Wheel. He lives in the US and works in field_of_work. And then the guy looks stunned and tells me the names of my whole fucking family. Turns out he was the flatmate of my uncle 30 years ago for about half a year. That was definitely one of the weirdest bar stories I experienced.
So me and my brother are fraternal twins. My stepmom passed away due to breast cancer when we were around 15 years old. She was like a second mother to us and had been around since we were very young, 5 years old. Now fast forward to our junior year of college. I attended a school in upstate N, while he attended a university in the state of Florida. One night, I woke up in sweat with tears coming down my eyes. I had the most vivid dream. I was in a house and my stepmother was there. I knew she had passed in this dream, which was a first for me. She hugged me, told me how handsome I had become, and that she loved me. I woke up drenched in sweat thinking WTF was that? I didn't say anything to anybody and went to class. As I'm walking back to my apartment after class, I get a call from my brother. His first words were, "I know this is going to sound weird, but I had the most vivid dream about Maggie last night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up." He went on to describe the same dream I had just experienced the night prior. We've never had a twin moment like this, and I don't really know what to make of it. But it's always been a story that I wanted to tell.
Was served lunch sometime during a flight. While eating, noticed that the woman next to me slowing down in her movements, slower cutting, slower chewing, etc. Suddenly she stops completely in her movements, fork and knife in hands, half-cut food on her plate, face bowed forward above her plate and nothing else. Touched her on the shoulder, pushed a little bit, asked her if everything was okay. No reaction. Couldn't really tell if she was still alive. Was it the air conditioning or her breath? No idea. Didn't want to panic and frighten everyone else, dead person. Made eye contact with the stewardess. Point towards next to me. Couple minutes later, 5 stewardesses including co-pilot form a barrier around our seats and like in a movie tried to get a reaction, aka "Don't you die on me." Woman wakes up, looks up and says just this one sentence, "I took really strong sleeping pills," and goes back to sleep in the same Tyrannosaurus posture. As if this has happened before, and she had anticipated this conversation. As if she knew that her mind would only be awakened long enough for one sentence. So for the entire remaining 6 to 7 hour flight, there is this lady next to me, mimicking a Tyrannosaurus. Her hands still grabbing the now removed fork and knife, drooling on the table, and everyone passing by giving me this questioning look. Best flight ever.
A little while back, my roommate was contacted by a wealthy man in the area who wanted to pay her to be his live-in pet for an entire month. She thought that this was a cutesy way of saying that it was a sugar daddy baby arrangement. Turns out what he actually meant was that she would be given room, board, and a very healthy allowance to spend a large portion of her day dressed as a cat, walking on her hands and knees, eating out of a bowl, using a litter box and, yes, sleeping in a little cage at night. Sex wasn't even on the table. He was only interested in having a human cat for a month. She seriously considered the offer for a weekend, and then politely declined. Edit. This allowance would have covered her college tuition for the semester. He knew what he wanted and was very motivated.
I was traveling in Honduras with a girl I was seeing. We were traveling with her sister and some other people, staying in a hostel. During the September 15th celebrations in this little town, There were a whole bunch of festivities going on, so we went out and enjoyed the day. At night, walking back to the hostel, we started to fool around a bit. We were making out in the town plaza. We couldn't go back to the hostel to take it further since our friends were there. But it was really dark outside, and the town plaza had some columns and areas that were relatively private. So we just decide to have sex there. We start banging in between a couple of the columns. So she is leaning back against a column and we are kind of on the ground. After a little while, she starts shaking and I look at her and she has this weird look on her face and is shaking like crazy. I think she is having the craziest orgasm I've ever seen. Then I felt a really strange sensation all through my legs. And I think I'm having a really crazy orgasm too. I had this sensation I couldn't really place, but it was familiar. Then I placed the sensation. Electricity. I realize I'm being electrocuted through my legs. I was wearing a condom. And I look at her and realize she is too. I pull us both to the side. I looked at the column she was leaning against, and there were exposed wires coming out of it. She was kind of crying and freaking out because she thought she was going to die and couldn't move. This is a long story from the early 1980s that has Kentucky justice in it. My family lived just outside of Cincinnati on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. My father's older brother lived here as well and was a father to 4 daughters. One of his daughters at the age of 18 or so was dating a guy who was a little older than her, who convinced her to move down south with him. My uncle approved and his daughter headed south with her boyfriend in tow. A Kentucky holler that his extended family lived in. Time passed and my uncle hadn't heard from his daughter in a while, and he started to grow concerned. My cousin called my uncle in distress from a payphone at a grocery store, saying she was being mistreated by her boyfriend's family and being held hostage and worked like a slave. Before my uncle could learn more, the phone was cut off. At this point in the story, it's important to know my uncle was an avid hunter and gun collector. He explained to his wife and other daughters the situation. He packed up his Oldsmobile Delta 88 with his favorite guns and headed down to the holler his daughter's boyfriend was from. He was going down in hillbilly country where there were no street names, just dirt roads and family farms. By the time he finally found their farmhouse, it was night. The boyfriend's family was on the porch shooting shotguns off into the air, fully expecting to scare my uncle away. My uncle stopped his car 50 yards from the house and popped the trunk. He methodically lined up his rifles on the hood of the car facing the house, tooling up like Arnold in Commando on the beach. My uncle was an extremely large man who was well known for having an explosive temper. Completely unfazed, he shouted up to the hillbillies, "If my daughter doesn't come down in 5 minutes, I'm going to come up there and kill every man, woman, and child I see." The boyfriend and his brothers ran back inside the house, and not even 1 minute later, my cousin came running out of the house with her single suitcase. Same uncle another time was driving on a bridge that spanned some small river. The bridge was old and only had enough room for 1 car to traverse at a time. He came to a standoff with 3 hillbillies in a pickup truck who were honking and yelling at him to back up. My uncle, ever stubborn, refused and instead got out of his car, figuring he'd show them how big he was, and they changed their tune. One of the hillbillies shouted to my uncle, "You don't scare us, there are 3 of us." And my uncle, like a psychopath, shouted back, "Do all 3 of you know how to swim?" To which they relented and backed up their truck to let my uncle pass.
When I was learning to fly at a sketchy flight school, I was doing a pre-flight check flight, close to the end of the program. I was doing the run-up in a Cessna, when I smelled something. "Do you smell that? Smells like gas," I say. Instructor to 1Y. Oh, shrugs, and no way. I open the door, and there is a spreading puddle of gas under the plane. Shit. The instructor panics, "Stay in the plane. I'll get help," and runs off. As soon as I got the engine off, I noped out of there, and watched the plane dump all its fuel on the runway. They kindly gave me another plane. An instructor. They fixed their plane. And a month later, I read about the same plane crashing due to fuel issues, 1 fatality. No significant repercussions for company.
My dad went to secondary school with John Lennon, and was a couple years older than him. Dad was known for playing the drums and being quite musical, and one day John asks him whether he'd like to be the drummer in a band he's forming. Dad was keen, but my granny said he needed to prioritize studying, and so he didn't join. The band formed and were called the Quarrymen, and I think a guy called Colin was the drummer instead of Dad, who I believe was later replaced by Pete Best and then Ringo as they changed to the Silver Beatles. And then the Beatles. I like to imagine that in an alternative universe my dad said yes, and that was history. I don't even mind that I wouldn't have been born if this had been the outcome. He really deserved to have had that lifetime